Done.
Perfect. And then if we can all go on mute, Ms. Bernice, whenever you're ready to get started. Lisa and Ellie, I hope you guys have a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you everyone for joining. Today's session will be talking healthy relationships. We're going to get started with this session. Okay, this session will be recorded. All previous sessions can be found on our YouTube channel, Bentley-based YouTube.
She might not know that she muted herself.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we hear
Okay,
you, Ms.
good.
Burns.
We're followed by a conversation with Booker Marshall. The chat will be open through the meeting to allow participants to type questions. Please keep in mind that we might not have time to get to all questions in the chat during the session. Please mute your microphone. Please be respectful with your comments. Be brief when sharing. To sign up for our newsletter, please visit Bentley Face Newsletter. That link will be dropped in the chat. Join us for our next sessions. We will have a session Tuesday, the 22nd of February, Wednesday, the 23rd, Thursday, the 24th, and Monday, the 28th. Talking healthy relationships. I'm going to turn it over to our presenter.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you and have a good evening.
Do you mind unsharing your screen so I can share mine?
Okay.
Thank you.
All
Okay.
right.
Oh, okay, now I need the host to enable screen sharing. So while you do that, I can get started and then the PowerPoint will follow me briefly. So my
Okay.
name is Ellie. I use she and her pronouns, and I work as a community educator at Response for Teens. Lisa, my supervisor, is on the call as well. She'll sort of chime in with some thoughts here or there. But for those who don't know, Response for Teens is an organization that's part of JCFS Chicago, and we work to empower young people to make safe and healthy decisions. So we do both clinical mental health support and then community education. So I spend most of my days in lots of CPS schools teaching 5th through 12th grade sex education and healthy relationship education. And today I'm here to do, a little under an hour together to talk about boundaries and consent and thinking about how we can sort of start conversations with your young people about healthy relationships, thinking about friendships and also romantic relationships. Oh, let me see if I can share. Not quite yet. Okay, I don't know if there's anything I can do on my end. And it looks like
There is not. So if Ellie could be made a co-host, because it looks like that screen sharing has been disabled for anyone who is not a host or co-host, that would be wonderful.
And while we're waiting, I'm just going to put a question in the chat to get us thinking. We're a really small group, so I'd love if people want to participate in whatever way feels good for you. So in the chat, on mute, I'm here for all of it. So I'm just going to put a question in the chat, and feel free to respond to that question vocally or in the chat, and we can start to do some brainstorming while we wait for the slides. So when you think about relationships and young people, what comes to mind? What are the first things that you think of?
Dating.
Dating, thank you. That's a great one. And I think that's a really big one when we hear the word relationship, especially on Valentine's Day. What else comes to mind for people?
Friendships.
Friendships. And depending on, oh, go ahead. I don't want to cut anyone off. depending on the age that we're thinking about, sometimes friendships feel more relevant and sometimes dating feels more relevant. And our conversation today will sort of encompass all of the different types of relationships we're thinking about. Any other thoughts about sort of relationships and young people? What comes to mind?
Their orientation.
Can you expand on what you mean a little bit there?
A lot of teenagers are basically exploring themselves, just trying to figure things out as far as, not to be inappropriate, it makes some people uncomfortable, but they're faced with a lot as far as what sexual orientation they want to gravitate to.
Thank you. That's what I thought you meant, but I wanted to make sure I understood before I assumed. Yeah, so thinking about the exploration that young people are doing for themselves, whether that's sexual orientation, gender identity, other parts of their identities that they're working through, sort of the relationship that they have with themselves, and then how that sort of feeds into the relationships they have with others. I also saw in the chat the parent-child relationship, right? We're here today to think about how we as parents can sort of support our young people. And so thinking about parent-child is another one of those friendships, relationship, romantic relationships, just another relationship we're thinking about. Anything else that comes to mind? And then Jillian, I don't know if you're able to make me a co-host, but if you just click those 3 dots, it should say like make co-host, and then I'll be able to share my screen and we can sort of make it through the content with some visuals.
No, definitely, Ellie. I was trying to.
No worries. It's hard to explain tech without being next to someone. So
I kept pushing to your name. There we are, and it wasn't popping up. Definitely. Forgive me, it wasn't responding to my prompts. You should be good now.
no, thank you.
Mhm.
All right. Awesome. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see this. Can everyone see the correct orientation and not my notes? Great. Okay. So
No, we can see your notes.
you can see my notes. Okay, hold on one second. I think I can fix that. Better? Great.
Yes.
I have 2 screens and I never know how to work them. Okay, so this warm up, I think, gets us thinking about just what we think about when we think about relationships in general, and friendships and romantic relationships and parent-child relationships and relationships with yourself. And we're going to sort of pick apart a lot of that today. And so I want to put up some just general learning objectives on the board to think about sort of what we're going to cover in our session today. So we're going to start by doing just some like level setting around common language that we use when we talk about boundaries and consent. And this is actually the exact language that Response uses when we work in CPS school. So it's, I won't talk to you the way I talk to the 10-year-olds, but it'll be very similar content and very similar language, just to sort of understand what we mean when we say boundaries and what we mean when we say consent. Then we'll do a little thinking about sort of what makes an adolescent relationship different from an adult relationship. And then the second half will be focused on sort of identifying unhealthy behaviors in any relationships, and then actually building some tools for how we can really communicate with young people in different ways to sort of start those conversations about healthy relationships. So I'm also going to let some people. Okay. So just a general definition of boundaries, right? Really just personal limits of what a person likes or doesn't like, and also what people find to be comfortable and uncomfortable. So this is how I describe boundaries when I talk to young people, and thinking about what makes people feel comfortable and what makes people feel safe are the 2 big words I use. But there's lots of different types of boundaries. So we have material boundaries. An example is, lending or asking for money, borrowing things from other people, material possessions, things that are tangible. We also have physical boundaries, so controlling our own bodies and deciding who gets to touch us, hug us, or kiss us, which I think is Usually when I teach, the most common boundary that comes up with students is physical boundaries and who is in their physical space. Mental boundaries, so being able to express our thoughts and opinions and the right to disagree and also agree with other people. And then emotional boundaries, so our private thoughts and feelings. So this is sort of a really broad definition of boundaries, and we'll see all 4 of these sort of coming up in the examples that we use. But when I teach, I try to incorporate, all 4 of these as much as I can, and to recognize that people have different boundaries that fall into all of these categories. And so then the second half is consent. So what do we mean when we say consent? And when at Response, we use the FRIES acronym, which is a pretty common acronym in the sex ed field. So FRIES stands for freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. And just briefly, freely given is what we mean is that when people are consenting and consenting to anything, we can talk about sexual activity, but we can also talk about borrowing money from a friend or borrowing clothing from your sibling or asking your parents for a ride, right? There's lots of different ways to ask for consent that have nothing to do with sexual activity. Freely given means that somebody is not coerced, threatened, and that they are voluntarily consenting to what, or not consenting to whatever it is. Reversible means that someone can take back consent at any point. And informed means that somebody knows what they're consenting to. So when I talk about informed, I think a lot about language. So when somebody says hook up or Netflix and chill, what do those terms mean? And do all people have a similar understanding of what those words mean? So that's informed is really the language piece of knowing exactly what you're consenting to. Enthusiastic, we think about as not having hesitation or any discomfort when someone is consenting. So a clear and enthusiastic yes is probably what you've heard. And then specific is similar to informed, but like consenting to specific things. And if you're switching activities, asking for consent again. And so this is the language that we use when we think about consent, and we constantly refer back to this FRIES acronym. And then we pose these 2 big questions. So am I limiting my partner's choices or my friend's choices or my siblings' choices? And have I obtained a clear and freely given yes? So boundaries and consent are sort of interwoven in a lot of ways, and they'll come up kind of interchangeably throughout the session, but this is how we sort of define all of these different components. And if I should have said this earlier, but if at any point anyone has any questions, like feel free to unmute or put something in the chat. I don't need to talk for an hour, and I'd love to hear from all of you. So I want to point out a couple sort of nuances within these really big definitions. So one thing that we talk a lot about with young people is power dynamics. So power generally is the ability to impact how a person thinks, feels, and acts. Every single relationship has a power dynamic that's inherent to relationships. Sometimes it's an equal power dynamic, sometimes it's an unequal power dynamic, but there's always going to be some sort of power dynamic in a relationship. That's just sort of the nature of being in relationships with other people. The way that we frame it to students is we think about when power dynamics are necessary. And we use often an example of the parent-child, right? So I talk oftentimes about like a 3-year-old cannot cross the street by themselves. They need a parent to cross the street with them. They're too young to be able to safely do that themselves. Then thinking about a teacher and a student and the power dynamic that's sort of inherent in a teacher and student relationship so that the student can learn and the teacher can educate. But then we also talk about unnecessary power dynamics, right? So they're where you don't necessarily need to have a power dynamic in a friendship or in a romantic relationship are the 2 that come up the most frequently. And so this is sort of how we think about power dynamics and how we think about whether they're necessary and whether they're unnecessary, but recognizing that they are really a common part of any and all relationships. So another kind of nuance within these conversations about boundaries and about consent is sort of the difference between when something should be private and when something should be a secret. And so I want to ask you all what the difference between privacy and secrecy is. And again, you're welcome to unmute or put something in the chat. What makes keeping something private different from keeping something a secret?
Ellie, can you hear me?
I can now.
Okay, I would say like keeping something a secret is basically honoring that person's wishes, you know, as far as confidentiality and not violating them and disclosing something that is very personal to that person or those individuals. And private could be, you could be having a conversation and engaging, you know, in something that is near and dear to you, but you're doing so like in a low tone, or you move that person or those parties to a different part of the room. Say, you know, Ellie, I have something that I want to tell you in private, you know, and things of that nature. And then it's a difference when you say, well, Ellie, I want to tell you something in private, but would you respect me enough to keep it a secret?
I hadn't thought of it in that way, and that's a great way to think about it. Thinking about privacy as being like set apart from a conversation in a different sort of tone, pulling someone aside, versus secrecy being confidential and being something that you keep between people.
Yeah.
Lisa put fear in the chat. I don't know if you want to expand on what you mean by that. I feel like I know, but I don't know if others. Okay, maybe you're typing. So I think another way to think about the difference is that everyone has a right to private thoughts and feelings. We all have things that we keep private, that we think to ourselves and we don't share with others. But secrecy involves hiding something. And this is often true with young people, that secrets are kept from others, whereas private thoughts and feelings are things that we sort of intentionally keep to ourselves. And so my next sort of question is, is why do young people keep secrets? What's sort of the reason that young people sort of intentionally hide things from others?
Many of them don't feel as if they have a safe zone where they can be freely without being judged or ostracized for whatever, you know, those reasons may be. So they feel the need to keep it a secret. And oftentimes they feel as if their parents and or an adult won't understand what it is that they are presenting or may be struggling with, or just simply want to share or express about themselves or incident that may have occurred in their lives.
Totally. Those are all such great points, right? Fear of, and I saw fear of being judged in the chat, not feeling like they have a safe space to share things, feeling like they need to be ostracized or punished. All of those things lead young people to keep things to themselves and to hide things from others when they really may need support. Okay, so instead of telling young people not to keep things from us, which, as you all likely know, it doesn't work super well, there are a couple of things that we can do instead, and I think Jillian sort of started to hint at those in your comments. So one of them is that we can model what it is to be honest and to be vulnerable. So it's important to remind young people that we make mistakes too, and to be honest when that happens, and to share kind of all our vulnerability with them so they feel comfortable sharing with us. I find that even when I teach, right, and I make a mistake teaching and I share that, you know, hey, I totally said that incorrectly, or that wasn't what I meant to say, let me try again. It shows young people that like we all make mistakes and that it's okay, this is a safe space for them to also make a mistake. We also can be really mindful of how we react. So young people remember how we respond when we are scared and when they are scared. And so if they come to us with something and they're, you know, afraid, and we react in a way that sort of reinforces that fear instead of, you know, reassuring them that we're here to support them and sort of coming at it from a more positive lens, that's how they're going to remember our reactions, and they're not going to feel comfortable coming to us again. And it's important to remember that honesty and safety are more important than consequences, right? So if a young person is hiding something and that thing might be dangerous or scary or illegal, whatever it is, right? It's better that they share that with us and feel comfortable sharing that with us, and we can respond in a way that's appropriate, as opposed to punishing them or, you know, having strong reactions that lead them to not share with us again. So these are just some things to think about. They're easier said than done, but ways that we can sort of encourage young people to be open with us as opposed to continuing that secrecy. Oh, interesting. Okay. So there's a couple different ways that we learn about our boundaries. And I think this is important to understand because as adults, we often don't think about sort of how we learned about our boundaries. A lot of our boundaries, we sort of just know what they are because we've lived with them and practiced with them for a good amount of time. So there's two different ways that people learn their boundaries. One of them is through self-reflection. So doing some thinking, and this is easier for adults that have a little bit more lived experience to say, what do I know that I like? And what do I know that I don't like? And that might include boundaries around touch or around time that you spend with other people or what you share with others, both like physically and emotionally. But self-reflection comes through experience, right? So as adults, we can self-reflect on our boundaries because we have lived experience and we've been able to say, I really liked that and I didn't like that, right? We've lived through lots of different situations that help us form our boundaries. So that sort of ties to experimentation. We often don't know what our boundaries are until we run into them, until we experience something that doesn't feel right with our boundaries, and then we set a boundary accordingly. So we can't expect young people to know what their boundaries are without life experience. And so part of our job as caregivers and as supporters of young people is to help them sort of identify what their boundaries are. And we'll talk about how to do that in a second, while recognizing that they haven't had as much lived experience and they just haven't been put in situations that sort of help them figure out what their boundaries are, which makes that self-reflection piece a little bit tough. Awesome. So one way that I'm going to talk about 3 different ways that caregivers can offer support, and then I'm going to show an example. So one of those is to sort of observe patterns. You can help your kid, your young person, identify patterns in their own behavior that sort of help them put words to their own boundaries. So an example is like, if you might notice that your young person doesn't like being texted late at night. And so you might say, you don't seem to like it when Kate texts you late at night. And it's a way to help them sort of name their boundaries through your observations, right? They might not realize that being texted late at night bothers them or is a boundary for them. But it helps if you can sort of put words to that through your observations. Another one is to wonder aloud. So this is sort of a way to help young people develop their internal, what we call like a stop sign. So you could say, I wonder how you'll know if something is making you uncomfortable. And then that sort of leads to a conversation of how a young person could figure out that a situation is making them uncomfortable, or a situation sort of is bouncing or bumping up against one of their boundaries. And so sort of thinking aloud helps them to start a conversation and helps them to start thinking about sort of that stop sign for them of when something makes them uncomfortable or feel unsafe. And then the last one is to validate and empathize. So it's really important to let young people know that it's okay to change their mind and to advocate for themselves when things change. So you might say, sometimes we think we want to do something and then we realize we're uncomfortable. So always speak up when that happens, right? Acknowledging that you may say yes to something and then you may decide that that doesn't feel comfortable for you anymore and you can change your mind. And that's part of the R in the FRIES acronym for consent, is that it's reversible, right? People change their minds, consent to something and you don't have all the information. You start that scenario and you realize it's not, or you're in that situation and you realize it's not something that's making you comfortable. It's not what you thought it was. Encouraging young people to advocate for themselves, to stand up for themselves, and to recognize that that's normal, right? Sort of switching your boundaries over time is really common.
And I'm gonna add one thing, is with the validate and empathizing. When we talk about power dynamics and fear, right? So we might tell our young people of any age, always speak up when your boundaries change, but we also have to remember that we have to create a space where they are not afraid of the reaction that they're going to get, right? So if the reaction is, well, that didn't bother you before, right? Or the reaction is something where it hurts your feelings, right? Our kids might develop boundaries even with us as their caretakers, as people who love them, but they might have boundaries with us that are different from when they were babies, right? And so even though it hurts us, we have to kind of take that moment and be like, okay, because even though we tell them to speak up, if we show them reactions that actually means it's not safe to speak up, we're sending them really conflicting messages, and that's also where secrecy comes in. And if they feel nervous of speaking up, that's another thing to talk through with them is how can you speak up? Who do you feel comfortable talking to? Why are you afraid, right? Help them kind of parse that stuff out. And it might not be all in one sitting.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that's one thing to remember is that these conversations, I think oftentimes we talk about them as like a one and done. You have a conversation once and like you move on and everyone knows all the information and everything's really great, but that's not realistic and that's not how conversations with anyone works. And so it's okay to like have a conversation once, think about the things that you maybe didn't say the way you wanted to or information that you forgot, and to sort of continue that conversation. It's really impossible to do all of this one time. And so thinking about ways to do it once and then do it differently and then do it again sort of reinforces that information. Okay, so there's a scenario on the screen that I'm going to read, and then I'm going to show sort of those three different ways that we can offer support kind of as an example in this scenario so you can sort of see it in practice. So let me just move all your faces. Okay. You're in the car with your child after they spent the night at Jordan's house. When you ask how the sleepover was, they say it was okay, but Jordan talked to me until 2 a.m. and I didn't get much sleep. After another sleepover a few weeks later, they explained that Jordan put on a scary movie that made me really uncomfortable. And so the question here is sort of how do you start a conversation with your young person in this scenario about sort of how they feel about sleepovers, and if sleepovers are maybe a boundary that they want to set or something that they no longer feel comfortable with. And so one way to do that is to go the observing patterns route, right? To say, hey, you don't seem to like sleeping over at Jordan's house, as a way to sort of initiate a conversation with your young person about whether or not sleepovers and sleeping over at this person's house specifically, are what feel good for them. So that's one way to think about it and one way to start the conversation. Could also try the wonder aloud technique of, I wonder why people think sleepovers are fun, and sort of see what comes out of that conversation to better understand whether or not your young person finds sleepovers to be fun, likes sleepovers, what the purpose of sleepovers are for them, if there are other ways they can have fun with their friends, sort of getting at all of those different pieces. And the last one, sort of validate and empathize. So sometimes we think we want to sleep at a friend's house, and then we realize that we're uncomfortable once we get there. It's totally okay to change your mind and ask to be picked up. So these are just three different ways, again, to sort of start this conversation. And each of these may lead you in a totally different direction. You can't see my hands. And that's totally fine. They're just different ways to start thinking about kind of how to initiate a conversation with your young person about their boundaries, because again, they don't have enough lived experience to necessarily know this for themselves. I hated sleepovers as a kid, and I don't think I understood why until I was like writing this scenario and doing some of my own thinking, because no one had a conversation with me about my boundaries. And I think it's important to start helping them think through those, because it's hard for them to do that themselves. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa for a minute or two or three.
Okay, so one of the things to think about uniquely in terms of boundaries is as we get into adolescence, right? So this program is for parents of all CPS students. So we have like the littles from pre-K all the way up through 12th grade. Once kids start puberty, really like they're adolescents, right? So that's young adolescents. So 5th grade, really on up, we have to actually start thinking about boundaries in terms of their brain. And so I'm just going to tell you a couple of things, because this is where it gets sticky, because it's also where we start seeing the influence of peer pressure, where we really start seeing the influence of dating and feeling really strong emotions in relationships. And that makes talking to your young person about boundaries difficult. It's also why it's important to start earlier, right? About any type of boundary that they feel. So I will go through just really quickly some of the pictures. So what I want you to think about is this light bulb at the front. So the light bulb at the front is the prefrontal cortex. What's important about that is all during adolescence, that is where they have experiences and risk taking and all of those things to create how they critically think, right? So we as adults have already been through that. That doesn't stop developing until really you're around 25. And that sometimes makes it difficult for adults to remember that teens don't, they need this experience, they need the risk taking. That reward center in the brain, though, right? So that right now, during adolescence, and especially young and mid-adolescence, so we're talking 5th grade to around 10th grade, 9th or 10th grade, peer approval lights up that part of the brain. It's the reward center of the brain, right? So in the same way that you feel when you accomplish something, when you get an award, anything like that, that is the peer center of the brain. It's actually the same way we talk about addiction, right? That reward center of your brain, dopamine is released. You feel good when all of that is happening. For adolescents, it's about peers, right? So if peers want them to push past their boundaries, they might do it and feel good for the moment because they're getting peer feedback, right? So the thing to think about with that is not to diminish their peer influence. You are still the hugest factor, but at this point in their life, peer influence is really going to help them make decisions and sometimes make not such great choices. The other thing to think about, though, is when we talk about time span, right? So if we are talking about relationships, and we're going to talk about romantic relationships, and we think to ourselves, well, a month is not that long. Like, okay, slow your roll. A month is not that long. You need to think about how long a young person has not even just been alive, but had interest in another person. Sexual and romantic interest does not start developing until puberty because of those hormones. So for us, a month is like nothing. But for them, a month might be a quarter of their romantic life. It might be huge to them, right? And what they also don't have is the ability, they feel all of the emotions as strongly as we do, but they don't have that light bulb area to kind of talk themselves down, right? To feel through things. So what we need to think about when we are talking about the adolescent brain and thinking about boundaries, when we're talking about how they are feeling emotions really strongly and not necessarily able to talk themselves down, and they are also risk taking looks different for them, right? So if we talk about boundaries and pushing past boundaries and taking a risk, if a friend is telling them, I'm trying to think of what a friend might tell them, if a friend is telling them to do something, right? And they know it's past they're like, I don't feel safe. I don't know about that. The risk might be they're going to get caught, they're going to get detention, they're going to get suspended from school. The other risk might be that their friend group is going to call them a loser and not want to do anything with them. As adults, we weigh that suspension much higher because we think down the road of how that's going to impact you, all that stuff. An adolescent, a young person, doesn't. Right now, that peer group, that is the bigger risk. Risking the loss of their friends is the bigger risk for them. So it doesn't mean that you don't allow them that you don't have consequences, but it means that when you talk them through this, you cannot minimize the importance of peer influence, and you should not minimize the length and emotional intensity of their relationships because it is literally what their brain is wired to do at this point in time.
Awesome, thank you. I couldn't find the unmute button. Yeah, I think this gives us some really good framing when we start to talk now about unhealthy behaviors and then how we actually start these conversations. Some framing for what's going on sort of up here with adolescents, and so much of that is out of their control. It's like literally what's happening to their brain and how their brains are wired and how they're developing. So if you've never been in a relationship before, right? A lot of young people have not, and we're talking again, friendships or romantic relationships, you might not know that specific behaviors are unhealthy. Like you may just think that that's what relationships look like. And so a question for y'all is sort of, where do young people learn about romantic relationships? Where do they sort of see romantic relationships? And good evening to everyone that just joined us. Go ahead, Jillian.
No, I was gonna say from their parents and or guardians or the, you know, caregivers or immediate adults in their lives. And unfortunately, a lot of times television and social media that you cannot always control with parent controls. So it's a lot.
Exactly. I think those are three of the biggest influences, and family, totally. And when we think sort of now about how the media, and I'm talking about all media, social media, movies, TV shows, video games, whatever, however you define media, sort of how does the media portray unhealthy behaviors? Dramatic, totally. And I think to build off the piece about dramatic of like, dramatic in a way that feels normal. Like it feels, if you watch any movie or TV show or you're on TikTok or Instagram, like those unhealthy behaviors that seem really dramatic become really normalized for what a relationship is supposed to look like. Totally, that it's romantic, that some of the, I'll put up a slide in a second with some unhealthy behaviors, and those behaviors become romantic. Like if somebody is treating you in that way, it means that they love you, it means that they care for you. And that's sort of what young people see and what young people internalize, and then sort of have really skewed visions of what relationships look like. And so on the screen now is 4 different sort of common unhealthy tendencies in relationships. And on the right-hand side is how a young person might justify that behavior in a relationship. So for jealousy, as an example, right, someone might say, they just love me so much, they can't stand to think of me with other people. Right. And again, they learn about that from a movie or from a TikTok or from Instagram, that someone being jealous means that they love you and that they just can't stand to think of you being with anybody else. This is a really appropriate conversation for Valentine's Day. Thinking about possessiveness, right? Like they're just being protective. They're just looking out for me. They just care for me. And sometimes like these tendencies, if you've never been in a romantic relationship before and you don't know, they might also feel validating in some ways, of like somebody really was protecting me and somebody really cares about me and they don't want me to hang out with anyone else. Like if you don't know that that's unhealthy and you're not, that's all you see in the media, it might seem really normal and really kind of exciting to be in a relationship and to feel like you're sort of somebody's world. Thinking about controlling behaviors, they care about me, they want what's best for me, they're looking out for me. And then stalking and harassment, which I, borderline on abusive behaviors, they must love me, they can't stop thinking about me, and they can't stop texting me. So I know that this is sort of what runs through young people's brains when they're experiencing some of these unhealthy tendencies, that they sort of justify them, and they justify them to their peers, and they justify them to their caregivers or other people in their lives when we know that these are unhealthy. And so the question now is sort of, how do you help a young person identify that these are unhealthy behaviors that are not signs of a romantic relationship and don't mean that somebody loves you, and that there are other ways to show love and to show support and to be in a relationship that don't involve these behaviors. So I have another scenario on the screen that I'll read out loud, and then I'm going to ask y'all to hopefully put in the chat some ideas about how sort of maybe what you think first, what goes through your brain, and how do you actually respond in this scenario. So Casey has started hanging out with a new friend, Jaden. Jaden seems pleasant and is always very respectful to you when they're over at your house. Recently, you've noticed that Casey is constantly texting but won't talk to you about it. You have a rule that phones are not allowed at dinner. Casey receives a text, takes out their phone, and becomes anxious when you tell them to put it away. They say Jaden gets upset when I don't respond quickly. So again, thinking about and put, any thoughts you have into the chat, both what you think, what runs through your brain, and then also what do you say? How do you respond in this situation? I know it takes a minute to type, so. That's a great one. So acknowledging that that might feel like a lot of pressure, to feel like you always have to respond quickly, and that somebody, you're messing with someone's emotions, you're making someone upset, you're disappointing someone if you don't respond quickly. Acknowledging the weight that that holds. Yeah, so one way is to use this as sort of a teachable moment to talk about, if somebody gets upset when you don't respond quickly because you're eating dinner with your family, maybe is that the best relationship to be in? And how do you want to be treated in a relationship? And is this person treating you the way that you want to be? So sort of responding with some questions and using this as a way to teach that, you don't have, this isn't the way that you deserve to be treated, and you don't have to be treated like this in a relationship, and you don't have to respond immediately to people. Yeah, totally. Sort of asking them, posing a question of like, do you feel uncomfortable by this person's response? Do you feel uncomfortable that you have to respond to this person immediately? Sort of getting at how that makes them feel. Yeah, acknowledging that this is sort of, this is possessive, controlling behavior. These are all great. And I'll put a slide up in a few minutes that has some actual questions that we can think about. Lisa, you look like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, and so this is all great. And I think, Ellie, you mentioned kind of opening with questions. One of the things that we really want to make sure that you think about when you're talking, especially in the adolescent phase, where they are going to push against parents and caregivers, right, is coming in with curiosity, coming in with questions to get them to think about it. Because as we see this as possessive, even if they are uncomfortable, if we come in fast and are like, look what's happening, this is possessive, this is like this person being possessive, one of the quick responses of a young person is, you don't know what you're talking about, and then a wall, right? And so coming in with questions and even realizing that it might not get settled in this one discussion is a really good way of trying to keep the door open so that you can have more conversations about it without being accusatory at first.
Yeah, and asking questions too sort of allows them to lead the conversation in certain ways. So, you're asking a question so that you can learn more about what they think and what they feel, and that empowers them to sort of be the ones, whether or not they realize it, sort of leading the discussion. So for our last little bit, I want to give some more like sort of tangible tips and tools and ideas for thinking about how we talk about relationships. So on the screen right now, there are 5 just general tips that are, I hope, pretty helpful. Let me just see. Yeah, this is a great point, Jillian. So the reason that you pose it as a question is because oftentimes our children feel as if they don't have a voice and naturally are defensive. And if we react instead of respond, they'll shut down. Absolutely. I mean, society in general sort of treats young people as though they are incapable of advocating for themselves and speaking for themselves. And so by asking them a question, as opposed to sort of speaking for them or speaking in statements, we allow them to sort of lead the conversation and really have a voice in their own relationships and their own dynamics. Totally. So the first tip on here is to talk about your family's values. So to think for yourself first about sort of what values do you want your child to bring to any relationship that they encounter in their lives, and then to bring those values into conversations with your young people. And those will look different for everyone here. We all have different values and we all value different things in our relationships, but bringing those into the conversation. Thinking too about modeling your own values, feelings, expectations, in relationships. I think Jillian mentioned earlier, like young people learn about relationships from watching caregivers and parents and family and friends. And so if you treat kids and friends and family with respect and support, they'll follow because that's what they see happening around them. So starting by sort of thinking about how you treat other people and how you act in your relationships, and then modeling that for them is really important. Acknowledging that their relationships matter. So showing warmth and support and really actively listening to their perspective on their friendships and their romantic relationships. And like Lisa said, right, like a romantic relationship that's lasted 2 weeks to us feels short and maybe irrelevant, but for them, 2 weeks is a really long time. And so really acknowledging that that relationship is important and that that relationship has meaning for them, and really actively listening when they share about their relationships. Telling the truth, the good and the bad. So you want to discuss both healthy and unhealthy relationships in peer and romantic relationships. So support sort of any positive expectations. If you're watching TV together or a movie or you're on social media, kind of acknowledging, pointing out where you see positive, healthy dynamics, and then also explaining that manipulation or violence or controlling or jealousy, that those are not acceptable and that those are unhealthy, right? They only learn healthy and unhealthy behaviors when someone sort of reminds them and teaches them what that looks like, and reminds them that certain things are not acceptable and that they don't have to be in relationships that are not healthy. So pointing those things out, telling them the truth, both sides of the coin, and then encouraging open communication. So it's okay to have those special or those sort of private moments in a relationship, but secrecy, keeping things hidden, can lead to isolation, and that's the first sign that often the first sign that somebody is being manipulated in a relationship. So if they feel like they can't share anything, if they feel like their relationship is sort of happening in isolation, it's often a sign that they're being manipulated, and that's unhealthy and often abusive. And so these 5 sort of help us start thinking about how we can talk about relationships. And then the next slide has a list of questions. And when we had the scenario a few minutes ago, you know, all of you were talking about asking questions and leading with questions and allowing young people to sort of respond and following the conversation based off their responses. So some questions you can think about are sort of, what makes you feel happy in a friendship or a romantic relationship? What specific behaviors bother you and why do they bother you? What do you consider to be okay behavior in a friendship or a romantic relationship? Like, for example, do you think name calling is okay? Why? And encourage them to be specific, to really name why those behaviors bother them, and to also, you know, not pass judgment on the behaviors that they name. What might they do if a friend or romantic partner makes them feel uncomfortable? Where do they see concerning behaviors on social media, at school? So these just sort of help start the conversation and allow them to sort of dictate where the conversation goes. And remind them that you're there to listen, right? Young people want information to come from the people that they trust. And so if they know that you will respond in ways that are non-judgmental and your reactions will be supportive, and so, you know, put honesty and safety over consequences, they're more likely to come to you and just to feel safe having those conversations. So I have 2 final scenarios, and then I want to open up the virtual floor for any questions. And so these 2, we want to think about sort of, how do you approach these conversations differently? What tools can you use to sort of have a dialogue with your young person? So your child has been best friends with Riley since they were in kindergarten. They're now in 7th grade. And you've noticed that Riley hasn't come over in a few weeks. You've asked if anything has happened, but your child just says it's nothing. You're concerned that something happened between the 2 of them. How do you approach this conversation differently so you can actually get information out of your young person? Yeah, so posing it as a question of, how are you feeling about Riley not coming over? Instead of sort of asking if anything has happened, asking more about someone's feelings and about sort of how that affects their emotions might be a better angle, and posing it as a question. Any other ideas? Yeah, so sort of acknowledging that it can sometimes be hard when friends grow apart. which I think is important in two respects. One, to just acknowledge the difficulty when you had a close friend and that friendship might be moving apart, but also to acknowledge that it's normal for friendships to drift and to grow and to kind of flow over time. And so I think that's a great one that serves sort of two purposes. Yeah, maybe just asking generally, where's Riley, and seeing if that sort of leads in a different direction, to think about, where's your friend, and seeing if that goes somewhere. It might not, but it also could. And, any of these might work depending on the situation and the person that you're, the young person that you're engaging with. But I think the key here is to sort of pose questions that empower your young person to share their emotions and to share what happened from their perspective, and to not feel like you're judging or you're accusing or you're disappointed, but just that you're coming at it from curiosity and from love and respect for your young person, and sort of wanting to know what's going on in their life. And then the last one is, so your child has started spending more time with Sam, and it seems like they're more than just friends. You've asked if they're interested in kissing Sam, but your child says it's none of your business. You want to make sure that they know how to ask for consent with a sexual partner. How do you approach this differently? So Jillian has a great point on the last scenario. So ask them if they've been making new friends, and is that why Riley hasn't been coming over, because they're getting to know their new friends? That's a great point to sort of understand more of the friendship dynamics going on. So is there someone else that you've been spending time with, or who are you spending time with at school, or who are you spending time with after school, to sort of see if there are other people that they've formed relationships with that you can then sort of start to learn more about. It's a great point. Any ways to sort of approach this conversation? Present it as if it's not important, and they'll be more willing to bring it up. Jillian, can you expand on that point? And I can give you a second to type if you'd like.
If it's okay, Ellie, I just wanted to speak right quick so it won't take much of your time, because I didn't know how many more examples you had. What I've noticed just with my own children, nieces and nephews, godchildren, you name it, like if we present like, well, Lisa, what's wrong? Why isn't Riley over here? It's like, Mom, I told you already, nothing, and different. But if you present like, it's nothing to them, your child is going to kind of react like it's not important to you that Riley is not here. Or they may say things like, well, Mom, it's nothing. And honestly, present as if it's nothing. And then next thing you know, a couple of minutes, it's like, you know what, Mom, Riley didn't do this, or I noticed they have a new friend. I feel left out. Oftentimes, if you don't present as if you're badgering them, then they're more, open, because our kids feel like we are so lame and unapproachable, and as if we don't understand. So I know it's kind of like a reverse psychology, but sometimes you have to play the mind games to let them know I'm your parent, I'm your mom, but you still have a safe zone with me. I've been where you've been. You just don't think so, but I really understand. So I noticed that kind of yields more positive results opposed to us verbalizing our opinions, even though oftentimes we're right. They're just not going to be received well because we're the parents.
Totally. And that has to do with sort of your reactions. If you come into a situation with a strong reaction, positive or negative, that maybe doesn't land as well as coming in with a different sort of maybe more neutral or more calm reaction that lends itself well to having a conversation. Cecilia said maybe awkward to discuss our first kiss experience. Totally. I think it depends on your own comfort level, sort of sharing about your personal life and whether you feel like the relationship that you have with your young person, if you feel like that would be beneficial. It totally could be, as a way to sort of personalize and show your young people that like you once were 12, 13, 14, 15 also, and like can relate. I think that can be a powerful tool as well. One other thing I want to point out is you can also sort of model asking for consent in different situations, in your daily life. So you can ask your young person if you can give them a hug. You can ask your young person, what their plans are after school. Sort of modeling consent, modeling asking before you do something, and pointing it out when you see it, whether it's bad or good, in the media, and showing like, hey, do you think that was consensual? Do you think that person asked? And sort of leading to a conversation that has nothing to do with them and their relationship, but just sort of gets them to start thinking about what consent means. Any other thoughts? I know we only have a few minutes. So I want to open it up for questions. Thank you all for being here on a Monday. I know it's like cold and gross outside and people with lots of things going on. But I appreciate everyone's participation and the conversation that we've started. And if anyone has questions, we have a few minutes now. I can stop sharing so I can see it.
I'm going to post a link in the chat in partnership with CPS, Response for Teens made a guide that it's called Don't Panic, and it is geared towards middle school and parents of, there's one for middle school and one for high school parents. I'm going to give you the link for our website, because on the website, there are there's I think 4 different languages. So English, Spanish, Arabic, and Urdu. And the resources are all there as well. And so we hope that it is really helpful. It's how to think about it. And then the other thing that I will say is, if you are parents of young kids, the earlier you can start modeling and talking about friendship, and even with middle school students and high school students who don't have romantic relationships, either yet, or they might not be interested in romantic relationships, friendships can be really unhealthy and toxic as well. And so I think sometimes our young people tune out when they hear healthy relationships and they're not involved in a relationship. We need to remind them that keeping your own boundaries is a healthy thing, and communicating about it can sometimes hurt and feel stressful, but that's because as a society, we're not used to it. And the more we get used to it, the more that we get used to it, the easier it gets. Awesome. Ellie posted it, so I don't have to. Thank you.
Of course. I know we only have like 2 minutes left, and I want to respect everyone's time. If everyone has any questions, I'm happy to chat or to stick around. I can also put my email in the chat. But other than that, thank you all. It's been lovely to learn from you and to spend some time together. And enjoy the rest of your week and the rest of your Monday.
Thank you to Ellie and Lisa. Thank you for that great presentation. So if anyone doesn't have anything else for Ellie and Lisa, we're going to close this session, and everyone have a good and blessed rest of their evening. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Karina, do you have a question? Or maybe. If anyone's hanging out because they have a question, feel free to unmute or put something in the chat. Sure. Do you have a specific question or just sort of in general conversations around birth control? Go ahead, Lisa.
Jillian, is it possible to let them unmute them, people who have stayed with a couple questions, to unmute it all? How do you bring up birth control? That's great. So bringing up birth control can be really sensitive, but one of the things that we talk about with young people too is that there's all sorts of reasons why people are on birth control, and going through the reasons to possibly start taking it as a precaution, right? Just saying, like, look, here are all the steps that you can take to keep yourself safe, right? So we think of sexual activity as this balance of kind of like freedom and making choices and responsibility, right? And so having the freedom to engage in this activity and to like explore this also means that it comes with some responsibility. And here are the ways, right? And that it's better to learn about it, not necessarily go on it yet, but learn about it before you think you need it. And talking about what makes you comfortable, what makes you uncomfortable in terms of like touching your own body, like all the different types of birth control that there are. And we have a resource for that that is linked, and we can also send it to anyone in FACE and give it, but just really a list of all different types of birth control and just saying that it's a way to help you stay safe. One of the many aspects of responsibility. Ellie, do you want to add anything?
I think that was great, just echoing sort of that people use birth control for all different types of reasons, and there's all different kinds to use. And so there's lots of choice that you can make around sort of what feels good for your body and what feels comfortable for you.
And if it feels really awkward, like there's never a good time, one is you can always do it during a yearly physical, bring it up. Always do it during a yearly physical. And then sometimes I actually really like talking in the car, especially when my young person is in the back seat behind me. So then it takes out some of the awkwardness of face to face. And I bring it up as a question, like, do you know if any of your friends are on it? Like, have you thought about it? I know personally, when I bring it up, I will say I went on it when I was younger, not for reasons that had nothing to do with sexual activity, right? And so I bring that up with my daughter, saying like it's okay, like it's not, this doesn't, because there's this cultural sometimes idea of birth control that if you're on it, it means you're having sex and that there's shame. Well, the fact is if you're on it because you're having sex, then you should be applauding yourself because you're responsible. So I think that, and sometimes using TV, because they don't show birth control on TV. They don't show condom use on TV. And so that is something even to say, well, what's missing in this relationship, in this person's life? What are we missing? And so that's one way to bring it up. Karina, did that answer your question?
Totally.
Yeah.
Okay, it's 5:03. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, y'all.
So thank you, Jillian. Thank you, Bernice. We're going to head out.
Thank you, ladies.
Sorry, you're welcome, ladies. Thank you so much.